Alright, I want you to come on a journey with me. Maybe you've just gotten off work or you're going home after a trip to the airport. It's dark out 'cause it gets dark at 4:30 nowadays. Anyway, you go through Gorst, many lanes brightly lit. The freeway curves to the right, and we're heading towards Bremerton. You pass the old rock quarry on the left, and the view of Sinclair Inlet opens up on your right. Old dock piers sticking up out of the dark black water. Train tracks are running alongside you now, but you've never seen a train on them. You catch a glimpse of the graffiti on the rock face as you speed by, and you wonder if Dan still loves Peggy. And then a hill rises in front of you. The top of it is dotted with little yellow cabins, at least 3 of them. They might have been cute once, but every window is busted out. Jagged shards of glass still linger in the window frames like sharp teeth. There's graffiti on every wall and every roof. The darkness inside of them is deep. Not a single light shines. You only have a moment to wonder about them before the road curves sharply left and demands your attention. Then they are gone from sight entirely. Just another roadside oddity, quickly forgotten until the next trip home. Have you ever wondered about these cabins? I know I have. Well, once upon a time, those cabins were the Cottage Cove Motor Inn. And the bluff they sit on, that hill and sharp bend in the road, is colloquially called Windy Point. What a romantic name. Doesn't it make you imagine a woman standing on the top of a hill, the wind blowing her hair all around her? Maybe she's watching for a ship to come in, bearing her husband home. Or, more likely, she's looking down on the wreckage of a car below her. The Cottage Cove Motor Court itself exists by the end of the 1930s and starts out life as a happy-go-lucky sort of place. There are 10 buildings altogether, 9 cabins and a manager's house. The cabins are 2 to 3 bedrooms, furnished, complete with oil ranges. They all had carports. That's what a motor court is, after all. An auto camp, an auto court. There's a lot of old-timey names for this, but it's just what we used to call motor hotels. Motels. It's a hotel that has guaranteed parking for your car. They're meant for people on road trips. They're usually on the cheaper side and have less amenities than a standard hotel because they're for travelers. Motels start to spring up in the 1920s with the introduction of cars. And by the 1930s, when Cottage Cove was built, the Model T had been replaced by something called a roadster. They were more comfortable for long trips, and of course, they were faster. The earliest mentions of Cottage Cove are the owner's wife, hosting social gatherings and garden parties there. They rent the cabins out by the day, the week, the month. Young newlyweds like to stay at Cottage Cove after getting married for a little privacy, while they search for their forever home. Births and deaths are reported in the newspaper with addresses at this time, and let me tell you, plenty of babies were made at Cottage Cove. After the war, Cottage Cove changes hands a couple of times. Post-war probably came with an economic lull for the motor court. There's less sailors, less workers at the shipyard, less people in town in general. On December 4th of 1948, 3 night shift shipyard workers were on their way home after work in the wee hours of the morning when they saw smoke pouring from Windy Point. The men immediately alert the shipyard and then run into the burning cabin to evacuate the occupants. The fire was likely caused by a smoldering cigarette on a sofa. This is just the first of the fires. Cottage Cove cruises through the post-war era. The rise of the highway system and car culture after the war are great for them. New stewards take over around 1958, a family named the Beards, a husband and wife team who will run the motel for the next 17 years. In 1962, the peninsula is flooded with visitors looking for reasonably priced and located accommodations near the Seattle World's Fair. Cottage Cove is happy to have them. Motels overall start to experience downswing in the 1970s. Family road trips go on the decline and will mostly die out by the 1980s in favor of more upscale hotel chains. In Bremerton, this starts to affect something that was called Motel Row, an old nickname for Kitsap Way. If you drive up Kitsap Way now, you'll still see why they call it that. Count the number of hotels up there as you go. Spoiler, my last count, I had 6. As the old motor hotels like Cottage Cove, the Dunes, the Chieftain, the Westgate aged out, and the shine wore off, newer, cleaner hotels were being built to replace them. The features that made Cottage Cove great in the early days started to become a liability. Ease of access to the freeway and the distance from town made it an ideal place to get away with a little trouble. Cars were sometimes stolen from the property, taken straight onto the freeway, and disappear. Windy Point developed a reputation of being dangerous. Cars are crashing on the road right out front of the Cottage Cove Motel with alarming regularity. For some reason in that part of the road, cars are often crossing the center line and causing head-on collisions, or veering off the road and landing on the railroad tracks or in the water on the other side. And then, in 1975, the Cove was robbed. At this point, it's being run solo by a 74-year-old woman, Lenore Beard. Her husband has passed, but the show must go on, and she's doing it all by herself. She's held at gunpoint while the robbers ransack her bedroom for cash and tear the phone lines out of the wall. In the end, she has to crawl to another phone to call the sheriff's office. She spends a couple of days at Harrison and retires from the hotel business shortly after her release. I think I would too after that. Then in February of 1988, a whole car was fished out of Sinclair Inlet at Windy Point. The 1987 Chrysler New Yorker had lain underwater, unknown, for 3 months. It had belonged to a young sailor named Willie Majors. Majors had gone missing the prior October, and his body had washed up near Bainbridge Island. But no one knew what had happened to him. His car was just missing. A nationwide alert was put out for the car, but it lay hidden in the water until a local passerby spotted it during low tide and called in to the police. The Navy Yard floated a crane down into the inlet and lifted the car from the water pouring out of the windows. There's actually a wild picture of this from the newspaper of the time. I'll make sure that I put it in the show notes on Substack. It looked like Majors had indeed escaped the car after it hit the water, but he still drowned before washing up near Bainbridge. In an ironic twist, his military record stated that he did not know how to swim. And Willie Majors is not the only casualty of Windy Point. I counted at least 30 serious traffic accidents and 6 deaths that all occurred, quote-unquote, near Windy Point. To say nothing of the usual fender benders and traffic incidents that occur on any highway. The combination of the sharp bend, the steep embankment, the proximity to the water, made this stretch of road particularly dangerous. In wet or icy conditions, which here can be a large portion of the year, just a moment's distraction could send a car either onto the railroad tracks, into the water, across the divider, and it often did. It's all downhill from here for Cottage Cove. The 90s would bring more fires to Windy Point, and Cottage Cove in particular. 5 altogether, 2 for the Cove. In 1996, after an undercover investigation by the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office, there is a drug bust at Cottage Cove. That's the kind of place it has become. 6 people are arrested for trafficking meth and stolen goods. It's estimated that about a pound of meth was being trafficked every week, worth thousands of dollars. And I have to confess, I had an uncanny moment while researching this part of the story. Older newspapers often print the full names of people who were convicted of crimes, and I found myself staring at this list of names of the people convicted in the drug bust. One of these names was jumping off the page at me, and I couldn't quite place it. I felt like I had seen it in print before, somewhere. That maybe I had held something in my hands with that name on it, and that I had seen it more than once. It was so familiar. After a while, I decided to take a break, take a walk up the driveway, check the mail, clear my head, and that was when it clicked. I received junk mail for that person to my house. Oh my God. After that person left Cottage Cove, they must have lived in my house, and I am still getting their junk mail. How wild. In 1998, Kitsap County discovered that Cottage Cove was on an old deepwater discharge for their sewer. To put it plainly, this means that the cottages were discharging raw sewage straight into Sinclair Inlet. This used to be common practice before codes were introduced, but we were trying to get rid of all of that and clean up the water. The county tries to make contact with the owners, but they refuse all correspondence and will not update the sewer to code. A civil lawsuit is filed by the health district, but Cottage Cove still refuses to comply. In the article about this, there's a direct quote, like, residents admit buildings are in poor condition. It's obvious that Cottage Cove has fallen into disrepair, and no one is willing to put money into it. Worse, there's 10 families whose homes are being threatened by this sewage situation, right? They are ordered to evacuate Cottage Cove by March 19th of 1999. It has been legally deemed uninhabitable. 3 days later, on March 23rd, Cottage Cove burns again. This time it's arson. It's pretty clearly arson. A fire is started on the 2nd floor of the largest building on the property, which was the manager's residence. It is yet again discovered about 4 a.m. when someone sees it burning from the highway. 24 firefighters fought the blaze. They also discover that 3 cabins are still being occupied in defiance of the order to vacate. These last families are rehomed to West Park, which isn't much of an upgrade. And Cottage Cove is finally empty, possibly for the first time since it was built in the 1930s. I wish I could say it stayed that way, but sadly, it didn't. And in 2002, it became clear that Cottage Cove had become the stomping grounds of a serial rapist. 2 women, if not more, were taken to the derelict cabins and raped repeatedly, often at gunpoint. Now, because we've crossed my sort of unofficial millennium boundary, I'm not going to discuss any more details of those crimes here, as these folks are likely still alive. I will leave some links in the show notes for any of my true crime junkies who want to learn more about this. And finally, in 2003, the county started tearing down the derelict buildings. The rape trial was the straw that broke the camel's back. It had been years since the county shut the properties down and evicted the residents. The owners are still refusing to talk. The courts finally give the county permission to start tearing it down. But even that would get stopped. In order to tear the structures down, they have a lot of red tape. They have to schedule to have the utilities get disconnected, and they have to perform asbestos inspections. And it's the latter that gets them. Cottage Cove was built in the 30s after all, when asbestos building materials were all the rage.
Smart woman. She's putting a new floor down by herself. Wise woman. She's using Kentile vinyl asbestos tile. Easiest flooring to install, easiest flooring to care for. Save every way with Kentile vinyl asbestos tile.
It turns out 4 of the buildings contain asbestos, which has to be remediated properly. It's expensive, and it seriously busts the budget for the project. Demolition gets postponed. A year later, the county demolishes the old manager's residence, but the smaller cabins remain. The county confesses that it's a struggle to keep these condemned properties empty because transients keep pulling the boards off and moving into the cabins. The last thing we hear about Cottage Cove in the papers is that the county has rewritten the ordinance it uses to deal with these nuisance properties. One opinion piece says it's too bad that it took almost 10 years to make any progress, which seems like the understatement of the century to me. 2 brutal sexual assaults are not too bad. It's fucking terrible. And that's to say nothing of the crimes that might have happened there that went unreported over the years. It's obvious that the rest of the cabins were never torn down, as you and I can still see them from the highway today. We're sitting here wondering about them in the year 2025. And county records show 8 buildings still remain on the property. So there's 8 of those cabins tucked up there on the hill. Cottage Cove was sold to its current owners, who live on the Seattle side, in 2016. Value was assessed last year at a cool $1 million, and it looks like they are getting ready to build a high-priced housing development. Last July, the county approved a land use permit filed for a development that will be called Eagle Point Townhomes. There will be 51 housing units in 15 structures, and of course with, quote, direct visual access south to the shoreline, unquote. What a legalese way to say they're going to have a view. And of course they're going to have a view. Access for that development will come down from Sherman Heights Road, and it will dead end in a cul-de-sac, which will sit right where those last visible remaining cabins are now. I often feel sad or conflicted when we're getting ready to tear down buildings in town, right? We've had a lot of that in the last year between Harrison and Bay Bowl and now the old Eagles building, which were all places that factored heavily in my life. But with this one, I can't say I feel any remorse, If anything, it's about damn time.
Do you have a question about Bremerton or its history? I want to hear it. You can find the show on social media at Bremelore, or visit the website www.bremelore.wtf. That's right, you heard me. Bremelore.whiskey tango foxtrot to leave me a voice message. I can't wait to hear from you.